Peyton Manning, Jimmy Graham, Julius Thomas, Mark Ingram, Josh Gordon, and LeSean McCoy all laid an egg for their fantasy owners this past week. Congratulations if you survived, but I'll let you know if you should be worried about these players here in weeks 15 and 16. And with Andre Ellington now on the IR and Cam Newton being in a car accident, some fantasy owners are in a desperate situation. I'll give you my top players that you should be adding from your waiver wire or free agency if you're in trouble. It's all on today's episode of the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast. What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast. I am your host, Nick, also known as Kliquid, and I am here twice a week, every week, to help you win your fantasy football leagues. And guys, our top story this week is the disaster of week 14. Now, obviously, there were some guys that came up in the clutch for you. If you were a fantasy owner of Jordy Nelson, if you owned an Aaron Rodgers, if you owned a Julio Jones, guys like that, big games out of those type of guys. There were some amazing games out of Le'Veon Bell and some other players as well. But some of the biggest studs from the 2014 season absolutely destroyed us from a fantasy standpoint. And the first one that comes to mind for me is a guy that I've been running all season, and the guy that I had as my number one quarterback going into the year, and a guy who I've been very confident in saying is my number one quarterback for the remainder of the year, and that is Peyton Manning. Denver Broncos quarterback, yes, Peyton Manning, 173 yards, no touchdowns, and 2 interceptions this past week. It was the first time that he did not throw for a touchdown in a Denver Broncos uniform. Unbelievable. And it just comes at the worst possible time for fantasy owners because, obviously if you got Peyton Manning, he's going to be in your lineup. You don't have a better option than Peyton Manning. I cannot foresee a situation where somebody would have an Andrew Luck and a Peyton Manning, or an Aaron Rodgers and a Peyton Manning. And other than that, you cannot bench Peyton Manning for anybody, in my opinion. I know I had somebody ask me, should I play Tom Brady or Peyton Manning going into this past week? And I said, I will never tell you to bench Peyton Manning. And I still, at this point, would still say, do not bench Peyton Manning going forward. But it is starting to get a little bit worrisome because this is actually another game in addition to the one that he had in week 13, where he threw for only 179 yards against the Chiefs. Now, he did throw for 2 touchdowns in that game, but guys, this is not the Denver offense that we've been used to over the past 2 seasons. I know that they've got injuries. Obviously, Julius Thomas being injured has not been helpful. CJ Anderson being so successful on the ground, and he's another guy that had a big game this past week. But him being so successful has made it so that the Broncos have not had to rely as much on the pass as they have over the past couple of seasons. So it's been kind of a tough go for the past couple of weeks here if you're a Peyton Manning owner. But guys, you still cannot bench Peyton Manning. Trust me, this is not the time to be benching Peyton Manning. I know there are a lot of people out there that'll leave comments in the comment section below, and they'll ask me, do I play Jay Cutler or Peyton Manning? Yes, you play Peyton Manning. I don't care what, it doesn't matter. Peyton Manning is going to get back. He's going to start putting up good numbers again. This is the best offense in the NFL, in my personal opinion. And I know, obviously, there's the Green Bay offense that's looked amazing this year, as well as the Indianapolis offense has looked great, and the Philadelphia offense has looked great as well. But Denver, they set the NFL scoring record just 1 season ago, and Peyton Manning's still on pace for an absolutely ridiculous fantasy season. So don't bench him. If you made it through last week, obviously, you're here in week 15, and it's not time to be finding another quarterback at this point. You got to ride the horses that got you here, and that's what Peyton Manning is. He is a rock-solid stud for fantasy. Do not be benching him this week or any week. until, next season, even potentially. And then we'll reassess based off of, what happens this offseason with the potential free agency situation out there in Denver. But for right now, Peyton Manning, in my opinion, still at least the number 3 quarterback. You could easily make a case for him still being the number 1 fantasy quarterback going forward. Next on the list is a guy who killed me in my biggest money league that I am in. Cost me my league essentially over the past couple of weeks. I ended up not making the playoffs in my biggest money league. I finished just 1 spot out of the playoffs, and the tiebreaker, of course, is points forced. And I finished with 20 points less than the person in front of me, and that was despite the fact that Jimmy Graham basically dropped a deuce on me for the past 3-4 weeks in a row now. The guy hasn't done anything practically. He's been just horrendous. 3 catches for 25 yards this past week, 0 catches in week 13 against Pittsburgh. It's not a good situation right now. The entire New Orleans offense looks terrible. I don't know what it is. Something is not clicking there. Obviously, they are not looking like they're going to make a run for the playoffs. Hypothetically, they still could because that division is so bad, but this just does not look good right now. Their offense is not what we remember it being over the past few years. Sean Payton, I don't know if teams are starting to figure out what he's doing on offense. If Jimmy Graham's injured, we haven't really seen anything significant anyway regarding Jimmy Graham. Everybody's kind of banged up right now, but he's out there. He's just not getting targeted. He's not catching any passes. So it's a frustrating situation if you're a Jimmy Graham owner, because obviously he is one of the most physically skilled football players in the NFL. But, I did say he's not getting targeted very often, but actually this past week he was targeted 10 times. So I don't know. It's a really tough situation to be in. But what I will say is that this is one of the most dynamic playmakers in all of fantasy football. And I understand that he has just destroyed you over the past few weeks. And, if you've got a Martellus Bennett or, you've got somebody like that could potentially slide into your lineup, I understand why you would want to consider that. But to me, Jimmy Graham is just too good of a football player. And I just don't see how he could continue to be this bad. I really don't. So he's going to be up against the Chicago Bears here in Week 15, who are the worst defense in the NFL in fantasy points per game allowed to opposing tight ends this season. Absolute dead last. So to me, this doesn't get any better for Jimmy Graham. You cannot find a better situation than this. I think that he is in line for a big, big game here. And, if he does end up going out there and, having a bad game again, and, you benched your Kyle Rudolph or something like that for him, and Kyle Rudolph catches a touchdown for, 40 yards and a touchdown, yeah, you're going to be frustrated that you didn't get those 40 yards and a touchdown. But what if Jimmy Graham goes out there and catches 2 touchdowns and 150 yards on 8 catches, like he's very capable of doing? That's going to hurt a lot more, and you're going to be kicking yourself the entire offseason. Why didn't I just play Jimmy Graham? He's my stud. I drafted him in the first round or second round. You just have to start your studs. And again, I understand he has been just terrible lately, and it killed me. And I'm not going to forget about it. But if I was still in the playoffs in that league right now, I would absolutely still be putting Jimmy Graham into my lineup this week. He's just too good to have on your bench, in my personal opinion. Another guy at the tight end position that he's kind of in a similar situation to Jimmy Graham. And I think a lot of this, of course, we talked about him in regards to Peyton Manning. Julius Thomas, still injured, but he was active this past week, which is the ultra troll for fantasy owners. And basically what happened is that on Sunday we found out that he was going to be active. And what that essentially means to fantasy owners is, he's going to play. Not to be. They ended up basically not having him on the field. So basically, if you were a fantasy owner of Julius Thomas this past week, unless you made a move where you started somebody in the early games, you probably had him in your lineup, and he probably got you another 0. It's been a very, very long time since Julius Thomas has done anything. These injuries are just... they're keeping him off the field. And right now, Denver, quite frankly, doesn't need him on the field because the rest of the division is not staying pace with them. They continue to win games, at least for the most part. They've dropped a couple here and there, but they continue to run away with their division, which is likely going to give them, at the very least, it's going to give them their division, and it's going to give them a home game in the first round of the playoffs, but it's also very likely to get them a first-round bye. So there's not a whole lot of rush right now in Denver to get Julius Thomas back on the field because they need him for the playoffs. So it's a tough situation right now. It's going to be another late afternoon game this week, and reports are saying that he is going to be out there against the Chargers in, what should be an extremely important game for San Diego if San Diego wants to try and make a run for the division. But we don't know. We really, really don't know. It's such a risky situation, and this is something that I've talked about over the past couple of weeks here on the show. Julius Thomas and guys that play on the West Coast, guys that are injured and they play on the West Coast, it's frustrating because they typically play in these later afternoon games, which can mean that there's only 3 games for you to choose from if you end up not seeing Julius Thomas be active, or, in this case, he was active this past week even, and it would have screwed you either way. But, over the past couple of weeks, he was inactive, and then he ended up, of course, you'd had to go out there and get somebody else to potentially put into your lineup or just take the 0 at the position. And if you would have had somebody that played in the early games, maybe somebody who was an East Coast player, for example, if you're out there with, a Rob Gronkowski, for example, that's one of the reasons that I like Rob Gronkowski a little bit more than other people do. They play a lot of afternoon, just the standard noon my time, which is 1 o'clock Eastern time games. And what it basically does is that if they play in that type of a format where they're playing in the early games, if he ends up not playing, we hear about that early in the day. We don't hear about it after all the other games have kicked off. So we're able to choose from other guys who could potentially step in and give us some fantasy points in those early games, or still choose from the guys in later games. It's really frustrating to own these guys on the West Coast. I obviously I don't avoid them necessarily, but like, for example, if I was looking at 2 players and I said going into the season, let's just say hypothetically, I valued Rob Gronkowski and Julius Thomas exactly identically. I said they're the exact same player. I think their stats are going to be exactly the same. I would have drafted Rob Gronkowski above Julius Thomas just because of the potential of a situation like this arising. And it's particularly with running backs because that position tends to get injured or have little nagging injuries more often. But even with receivers, tight ends, and even sometimes quarterbacks, this can be something to keep in mind. So again, I'm not going to sit and harp on this forever, but it's frustrating. And it's something where, in my opinion, right now, if you're a Julius Thomas owner, you have to set yourself up with somebody who you are comfortable with going into this Sunday's game. You cannot sit and wait to see if Julius Thomas plays and then go out there and try and acquire somebody. I just don't like that situation. I don't think it's the right way to do it right now. I think that in the fantasy playoffs, you cannot afford to take a 0. You just can't. You have to get somebody out there in your lineup. And if Julius Thomas plays against San Diego, yeah, he might have a good game. He did only catch 2 passes for 23 yards against them, though, back in Week 8. So this isn't a defense that he absolutely destroyed earlier this year. So in my personal opinion, I'm probably benching Julius Thomas unless I just have awful options, which, because of the tight end position, that very well could be for some people. And you might have to roll the dice on a Julius Thomas playing and being successful. But, if I've got a Coby Fleener, or if I've got the aforementioned Kyle Rudolph even, or, Jason Witten, or guys like that, I'm playing all of those guys right now above him. And I understand their upside isn't as high, but then again, their downside is also not 0 like Julius Thomas is, in my opinion anyway. I think all these guys should be able to catch at least 1 pass this week. So to me, you kind of have to look at Julius Thomas as a likely bench guy. And, if he's active out there, we want to see him fully practicing. We don't want to just hear that he's active and then sit and watch him give us a 0 again and not be on the field. Next guy that I want to talk about, Mark Ingram for the New Orleans Saints. Obviously, we talked about this. That whole offense is just not good right now. Jimmy Graham's struggling and Mark Ingram is struggling. 10 attempts for 43 yards versus the Panthers this past week in what should have been an excellent matchup. The Panthers have not been good against the run this year. Their defense has just not been good in general. And for Mark Ingram, the guy who has been a very nice fantasy surprise for everybody, we expected him to put up good numbers. So the 43 yards, that's frustrating. But what's even more frustrating is the fact that he hasn't scored a touchdown since all the way back in week 9. The Saints on offense just in general are not moving the football like we're used to, which is giving Mark Ingram fewer chances to score touchdowns. So he's still getting decent yardage, but he's not a big pass catcher. He'll catch you 1 to 3 passes per game, but that's nothing spectacular. And, because of that, you aren't really getting the bonus points if he doesn't get into the end zone. So even if he does rush for 100 yards, it's only 10 points. Not that that's a bad game by any means, but if he doesn't get into the end zone, it's not a big enough game that we're excited about it. So it sucks right now for a Mark Ingram owner because the rest of the offense, in my opinion, is holding him back. And it's always been that Mark Ingram's been the part that holds that offense back, it seems like. Now, they almost should be relying more on Mark Ingram than they do Drew Brees. That's how bad things are down there in New Orleans. The Bears have allowed the 8th most fantasy points per two opposing running backs this season, however, so I do like Mark Ingram to have a bounce-back week this week. If there's a defense out there that can give him a solid fantasy productive game today or this week, I definitely think it's the Bears. They have just been awful, and they have nothing to play for anymore at this point. So my personal opinion is Mark Ingram has to be in your lineup again. You got to trust him. It's been a frustrating couple of weeks here, but I do think that he is going to have a nice game for you this week. Next on the list, Josh Gordon. 2 catches for 15 yards in week 14 against the Colts. Now, I talked about Josh Gordon as being somebody who could potentially be a bench guy this past week just because the Colts have been so good against the pass this season. They're not like the number 1 pass defense, but they're a top 10 pass defense this year. And Brian Hoyer was looking absolutely horrible as a quarterback, and finally he is going to be sat down for Johnny Manziel. But Josh Gordon, the fact that he only had 2 catches for 15 yards in your fantasy playoffs, he's looked pretty good other than this past game since he came back from the suspension. So a lot of us had him in our lineups. I did in a league have Josh Gordon in my lineup. Thankfully, I was able to weather that storm and still get the W in that league. But man, I was sweating bullets watching him just not catch any passes. So it's going to be an interesting proposition here to see how he does connecting with Johnny Manziel. I think he's a risky play this week because we don't know exactly how much Manziel is going to throw the ball, but it's still going to be very hard to find somebody who is better than Josh Gordon at this point in the season. He's a stud player. The physical ability is second to almost none, and if Manziel continues to target him in the same type of fashion that Hoyer did, there should be some fantasy production to go around. I'm not overly worried about Josh Gordon, but I am more worried about the quarterback situation there. I want to see what happens if I can. But, like I said, it's week 15 and 16 at this point. There's not a whole lot more that we can do as far as waiting. You kind of have to go for broke and try and get those big point totals. Last guy that was a disappointment this past week, and of course there were many guys, but these were just the ones that really stood out to me, and of course let me know in the comment section below if there were other guys who were frustrating to you this past week, because I know there were a ton of them, and there were other guys who bailed you out if you had that bad game out of somebody who, somebody came out there and threw for 4 touchdowns, and, Cam Newton had that monster game that he had, and, stuff like that can happen that will save you. But LeSean McCoy was the number 3, 2, or 1 fantasy football pick in almost every single league earlier this season going into the draft. He has been so up and down, too. He's had some great games, and he has had some really bad games. This past week, 17 carries for 50 yards against Seattle. Very disappointing. Under 3 yards per carry. That is just not a good number for LeSean McCoy, who is typically one of the highest yards per carry backs in the entire league. He's very dynamic, and he doesn't typically go down early on runs. So that's a little bit surprising. But what I will say is that Seattle's defense has been playing significantly better recently than they did earlier in the year. And LeSean McCoy, just for whatever reason this year, they are not utilizing him in the passing game. So it's in addition to the fact that he only ran for 50 yards against this tough Seattle defense, he's basically catching no passes. He has 4 catches over his past 6 games. That's like Alfred Morris numbers. Really, it is. It's that bad at this point, guys. I mean, if you were to take that over the course of a season, that's what, 10 receptions on the year, if that was the pace that he was at? That is not good. That is just not good at all. So you have to really consider right now that LeSean McCoy, obviously he's been a major disappointment, but he is somebody that you can bench if you have other good options. Unfortunately, it's hard to say that many people are going to have better options than a guy who was a top 5 pick and has had good games this season. But I know that when I see comments and I see tweets at me, people are asking me, should I play this guy over LeSean McCoy? And there are times where I'm saying, yeah, you should. You really have to look at these matchups. I don't think LeSean McCoy is a guaranteed no-brainer starter every single week. But this week, I really do like him against the Dallas Cowboys. He beat them up for 159 yards and a touchdown when these teams played just 2 weeks ago on Thanksgiving Day. Get him in your lineup this week, and then we'll reassess from there in the championship week if you guys do make it through it. Oh, that is going to be a tough... this game, this Sunday, guys, between the Cowboys and the Eagles, for me, I'm really sweating about it because obviously you guys know I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. And I don't want to see them lose. If they lose this game, it is going to be very tough for them to make the playoffs. They need a win, and then they need a little bit of help still in order to get into the playoffs. So, you know, the Cowboys are certainly knocking on the door of the playoffs, but this look is just, it's all playing out to look like it's going to be another one of the seasons where the Cowboys finish on the bubble and don't make the playoffs, and then everybody blames Tony Romo, despite the fact that he has been unbelievable this season. The guy's playing with broken ribs and a fractured back and all this stuff, and he's putting up amazing numbers for the most part. There's been a couple weak games in there, but I mean, for the most part, Tony Romo has been an elite quarterback. I mean, maybe not at the level of an Aaron Rodgers, Peyton Manning, and an Andrew Luck, but certainly in the conversation with the next group of guys. He is putting up amazing numbers and just playing the grittiest football that I've seen. But if they're going to try and win this game, they have to shut down LeSean McCoy, and I don't see it happening. I think LeSean McCoy is going to have a big game for them again this week. Hopefully they get him involved in the passing game because that would be great for us fantasy owners who do own LeSean McCoy. We really need to start getting more receptions. We came into the year expecting that this guy would get 50 or more catches, and that is not going to happen. I mean, at this point, we're just hoping that he gets 3 a game. And that pace has not happened in quite some time. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens this week, but I do like LeSean McCoy. Now I want to move on and talk a little bit about a couple of the major injuries that happened this past week. There's 2 of them that I really want to go over, and of course there are others that are, you know, affecting guys. We touched on Julius Thomas. We touched on a couple of other guys who, you know, are kind of banged up, but the big ones this week, Cam Newton in a car accident. And I actually did a specific video on this. If you guys didn't see it, check back in my previous videos because I released a video where I talked about this and the Johnny Manziel starting situation in Cleveland. But I really want to focus on the Cam Newton one because it doesn't sound like he is going to play. He does have 2 fractured bones in his back from the car accident that he was in where his truck rolled numerous times. It's very similar to Tony Romo's injury that he sustained earlier this season and he's still dealing with, which actually caused him to miss a game after it happened. So this, in my opinion, could actually affect Cam Newton more than it did Tony Romo and more than it currently is affecting Tony Romo because of the playing style that Cam Newton has. It's a very athletic playing style. It's one where he does end up taking more hits than a lot of quarterbacks do. So, you know, if he's out there and he gets hit in the back, is it going to knock him out? It very well could if he does play. So it's very, very risky right now to be starting Cam Newton, and that sucks because, like I said, this past week he had his biggest fantasy game of the year. It's one of his biggest games that he's ever had in his career, a monster fantasy day against the Saints in a game that his team just had to win. So from a fantasy standpoint, it's really, really frustrating that he is going to be out, but we do have to look elsewhere. And in my opinion, he is not a start-worthy player in a 14-team league. Possibly in a 16-team league or deeper, you could consider starting Cam Newton this week if he does play. But if he doesn't play, it's going to be Derek Anderson. I do think that Kelvin Benjamin takes a very slight downgrade with from going to Derek Anderson from Cam Newton. But at the same time, though, he did have some interesting connections earlier this season when Derek Anderson came in relief of Cam Newton in a couple of games, caught a couple of touchdown passes from Derek Anderson. So there is certainly some upside here still for Kelvin Benjamin. I would not be taking him out of my lineup. But for everybody else in the offense, I don't really think it really affects things all that much. You might be able to argue that Jonathan Stewart's not going to be able to have the read option threat with his runs, but I still think Jonathan Stewart's running just really well. It's not even necessarily the fact that the read options, affecting defenses all that much. I kind of think it's just Jonathan Stewart's more healthy than he has been for the past couple of seasons, and he's looked good over the past few weeks. So if you've been starting Stewart, or if you have a flex spot, I don't mind playing him. I kind of think he would do okay this week. Hopefully he does. But, we really have to pay close attention here to what happens with Cam Newton. Don't put him into your lineup unless you are in a desperate situation at quarterback, would be my opinion. The other guy, Andre Ellington, has been placed on the season-ending IR for the Arizona Cardinals. Just another guy in the long list of players who have sustained injuries for this team throughout the year. They've now missed their starting quarterback and their starting running back from the beginning of the year. The two guys who this offense was really based around. And it's not looking good right now for Arizona. They did get a W this past week, but man, they have not been looking like the Arizona Cardinals that we saw earlier this year when they ran out with the best record in football through 12 weeks, or was it 13 weeks? So it's for Andre Ellington owners, this is a really big killer. But at the same time, I've been talking about the fact that I believe Andre Ellington might be the biggest bust going down the stretch here for fantasy football owners, because he has one of the most difficult schedules in the league going down the stretch here. He still has games against the Seahawks and the 49ers and the Rams this week. Three of the best defenses in football. I mean, these are not easy teams to run against. So, I mean, obviously, if Andre Ellington was out there, I'd be telling you to play him just because he gets so many touches. But now that he's not out there, you can feel free to put in other players, and you don't have to really worry about him getting you a 5 for the week or something like that, some terrible game that he could have gotten conceivably against one of these very difficult defenses. Now, we are going to talk in a few moments here about some players in that offense who will probably be ending up stepping up to take his role, or at least a chunk of his role. But this is not the same offense anymore without Andre Ellington on the field. He has been one of the biggest backs in the league as far as number of touches go. So it's not an easy thing to replace a guy that touches the ball 25 times a game like he was. Even if you have a couple of guys, it's just he's a dynamic type of playmaker, and there just aren't other players in this offense that are like that. So it's going to be something that affects more than just the running game. I do think that they are going to see fewer stacked boxes now as well in the passing game because Andre Ellington's not on the field, and that's of course going to make things tougher for the passing game. Drew Stanton has not been great, and frankly, the wide receivers, Michael Floyd's been a major disappointment this season. Larry Fitzgerald's been on and off. They have a couple of young receivers as well that have stepped up and really made some plays this year, but I don't really think that they're every week fantasy starters by any means, especially at this point. But I think you do have to knock down Fitzgerald a little bit, and you do have to knock down Floyd a little bit as well. Just given the fact that Andre Ellington's not going to be on the field, they're going to see more attention from the safeties, and frankly, it's going to be tough for this team going forward. I would not be surprised to see Arizona not win this division. I would not be surprised to see them barely scrape in as a wild card this year. So, that could very well happen here. The collapse could be coming for Arizona, and it sucks because they really did look good when they were healthy. But with Andre Ellington being on the sidelines, Cam Newton being injured, still Julius Thomas being injured, and all these type of things, I do want to give you guys a couple of players here that I'm looking at on the waiver wire. Obviously the waiver wire has gone by at this point, but a lot of these players are just going to be out there for free agent pickups. And if you're in a tough situation where you really need to find somebody, I want to give you some guys who you could consider picking up and hopefully there's somebody that could give you a decent amount of production here in weeks 15, 16, and potentially even 17 if you play that deep into your year. First guy is Jonathan Stewart, obviously, of the Carolina Panthers. We talked a little bit about him. He has been just running really, really well. And he ran for 240 yards and a touchdown over his past 2 games. So successful running game there in Carolina right now. Again, obviously, I mentioned that Cam Newton not being on the field is probably going to affect this running game. They're not going to have the threat of the read option with Cam Newton taking off, which is going to make it so that they can focus a little bit more on Stewart. But at the same time, though, I do think that Derek Anderson has proven that he is a competent enough quarterback that they're not just going to be able to stack 9 guys in the box to stop Jonathan Stewart. He does have a good matchup here against the Bucs in week 15, and that should be something that he can potentially exploit. Next guy, somebody who you may not even have heard of, Stedman Bailey of the St. Louis Rams. He is only owned in about 30% of leagues at the moment on ESPN. 14 catches for 236 yards and a touchdown over his past 3 games. So solid production, not just a flash in the pan type of 1 week production. He's putting up solid numbers here, and he has very clearly, in my opinion, established himself as the Rams' #1 target in the offense. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that much because that offense isn't very good, but he does have good matchups here in the next couple of weeks against the Cardinals and the Giants. Obviously, the Cardinals defense has been great this season, but they're definitely much better against the run than they are the pass. Patrick Peterson has been somebody who has allowed receivers to get open this year. He is not a Richard Sherman lockdown type of cornerback this year, a Joe Hayden, a Darrelle Revis type this year. So to me, I don't think that I'm that worried. Even if Patrick Peterson does line up on Stedman Bailey, I don't think that it's going to be a lockdown type of a scenario. I could still see him catching 5-6 passes this week. Next on the list, we have Charles Johnson, who is only owned in about 10% of leagues. He is on the Minnesota Vikings, of course, at wide receiver, if you're not aware. He actually won the starting job over Cordero Patterson a couple of weeks ago. Patterson, somebody who I came into the year saying I think is going to be one of the biggest busts in fantasy, and thankfully I was dead on with that. Did not take him in any league. I tried to recommend that you guys get rid of him early in the year, so hopefully everybody who's listening to this show does not have Cordero Patterson on their lineup at this point. But if for whatever reason you do, you might as well drop him and pick up Charles Johnson, because Charles Johnson has been more productive than Cordero Patterson this year. Just pure numbers he has. 103 yards and a touchdown in week 14 against the Jets. Solid production in a game that was surprisingly high scoring, but even still, Charles Johnson, I think, is somebody who could potentially give you, a flex option or a wide receiver 3 in your standard leagues. And I don't necessarily think he's somebody that's going to go out there and catch 10 passes or anything. So I like him a little bit less in PPR leagues than I do standard leagues. But at the same time, though, I do think that he's a decent playmaker. And I think it's pretty clear that he's become Teddy Bridgewater's favorite target in the passing game. So he's somebody you could definitely look at as somebody who could give you some decent production here in the final weeks of the season. Next guy is also on the Minnesota Vikings, Matt Asiata. He is now the starting running back in Minnesota with Jerick McKinnon on the IR. Unfortunately, he has a terrible matchup this week against the Detroit Lions, so I'm not excited about playing him. But if you're somebody who needs a running back, you could definitely do worse than Matt Asiata. He has had a couple of good games this season. He's had a couple of multi-touchdown games, and he's not a bad player. I don't necessarily think that he's as big of a playmaker as a Jerick McKinnon. And the fact that Ben Tate is on the roster is a little bit concerning, because Ben Tate could at any point come out there and get 10 touches as well, which would really hurt this offense, or really hurt Matt Asiata's production in the offense anyway, I should say. So, I'm not super excited about Matt Asiata, but if you need a running back, if you lost Andre Ellington and there's just nothing else out there, I would consider going out there and picking up Matt Asiata. I do think that he can give you some at least decent production. He's going to touch the ball a couple of times at least this week. Next on the list is another running back who, again, I'm not super excited about because of matchups, but it's Kerwin Williams of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, I do have to take some fault here, just like everybody else did. We all told everybody this past week that it was either going to be Stephon Taylor or Marion Grice that takes over the role for Andre Ellington. And that just hasn't been the case. It was Kerwin Williams who got almost all or I shouldn't say all the touches, but he took the ball 19 times for over 100 yards against the Chiefs. And that's a tough defense. The Chiefs have been good against the run, at least from a fantasy standpoint this year. So, it's not an easy thing to put up good numbers against that Chiefs defense. Now, unfortunately, he has terrible matchups coming up here. We talked about this. The Cardinals, arguably the toughest fantasy football playoff schedule in the league. They are up against the Rams, the Seahawks, and the 49ers to end the season. Doesn't get much worse than that. So, in my opinion, he is not start worthy. If you're good at running back or if you have other options, I would look elsewhere. But again, he could end up touching the ball 12 to 15 times this week or more, depending on how the actual game plays out. But, even if he does touch it 5-6 times, or, for 5-6 yards per carry at 12 touches, that's only 60-70 yards. So, it's not a great performance unless he gets into the end zone. I don't think that he's going to be out there catching a ton of passes like Andre Ellington did. So, don't be super excited to add him to your team, but, you could potentially, if you have a high waiver claim and your opponent has Andre Ellington, you could just be a jerk and go out there and get Kerwin Williams just to completely make it so that he doesn't have anybody to play against you this week. That's a strategy that a lot of people don't think about. You have to also look at your opponent in the playoffs and see what they have going on, because if you can block them from getting any good players, now is the time to do it. You definitely need to do that, and especially if you're in the situation where you think that you're going to end up winning this week, or you do end up winning this week, look at what is going to happen for you in the finals, in the championship weeks. You want to look at those players' rosters and see if there's any obvious spots that they need to fill holes at for the playoffs. And if there is, you go out there and you pick up the best player at that position if you have the waiver wire order ranking above them. Unless of course you need to do something for your team. But don't just let them get good players. You have to, even if it means that you drop other good, decent players at another position that they're more stacked at. It's not a bad strategy. It really isn't. In some cases, I would end up dropping a pretty good running back for a quality receiver just because I know that my opponent's not going to be able to go out there and pick up and start that running back. And given the fact that it's the championship week, who cares? They can have him if they want. You can go pick up that player and sit him on your bench. I don't mind. He's not going to start for me anyway. And he's not going to start for you, so what's the point? But what I am going to do is block you from getting this elite receiver. And that's really something that we need to consider. So definitely always be thinking about not just your lineup, but your opponent's lineup here in the playoffs and what you can do to make things tougher on them. Dante Moncrief is another guy that I'm actually considering adding in a couple of leagues here for the Indianapolis Colts. Now, he did only catch 3 passes for 33 yards in Week 14 against the Browns, but Reggie Wayne has a torn triceps, and he's been limited. Moncrief has been getting more playing time, and I do think that's actually set to increase here over the next couple of weeks. He has an amazing matchup against the Texans in Week 15. They've allowed the most receptions to opposing wide receivers this season, so it doesn't get much better than this for a matchup for Dante Moncrief. If you need a guy for 1 week and you need a player that could potentially get you a touchdown or 5 to 6 catches in the passing game, Dante Moncrief, I think, has a good chance to give you some solid fantasy production this week. I would certainly go out there and pick him up if you're in a situation where you're not confident in your flex. Another guy, and the final guy on this list today, Marquise Lee of the Jacksonville Jaguars, wide receiver. He is only owned in 2% of leagues right now. 11 catches over his past 2 games, not too bad, and he has great matchups against the Ravens and the aforementioned Titans here in weeks 15 and 16, your championship weeks in most leagues. So if he's out there and you need somebody, just like I mentioned with Moncrief, I would rank Moncrief slightly above him, Charles Johnson above him, and Stedman Bailey above him. But all of these guys are players that you could consider going out there and playing this week if you need to. Again, Marquise Lee, I think, is he's definitely somebody that has great matchups here against the Ravens and the Titans. I just don't have as much confidence in that Jacksonville offense overall as I do, say, the Colts offense for Dante Moncrief. So think about that. But of course, if he's the only guy available, go ahead out there and pick him up and roll the dice on him. You could certainly do worse. So guys, that is going to do it for today's show. I want to make sure though that you guys are aware, if you have any fantasy football questions here for week 16 and your lineups, please tweet them to me at Kliquid TV, or of course you can always leave them for me in the comment section below, and I will do my best to answer those questions for you. Guys, it is championship week in weeks 15 and 16, so Do not be out there not knowing what to do with your lineup. Obviously, I don't always have the answers. I'm not always going to be 100% of the time right, but I think if you go through the comment section on my videos and you read what people are asking and you see the comments that I'm leaving and the reasons that I'm leaving them, even if I'm not right, you can understand why I went that direction. And I am certainly right more often than I'm wrong. So hopefully that can help you guys out. I want to wish everybody good luck this week. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will have another episode here on Saturday for you guys. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you learned something, if you enjoyed it, please be sure to give this video the thumbs up, and also make sure that you click the subscribe button below so that you can be updated when I put out the next episode. Thank you guys again. Be sure to check back later this week. We'll have a full preview for Week 15, and I will, of course, answer all of your questions from YouTube and Twitter. Thank you guys again, and I will see you guys next time here on the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast.